I'm Deborah Satz. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Ethics in Society, and on behalf of the center, I want to welcome you to the last event of the first year of a 2-year series of lectures, plays, discussions, and classes about the ethics of wealth. Led by the center, this is a joint effort of many units on the campus, from the Humanities Center to the law school, from the Departments of Religious Studies to the Department of Art and Art History. Before turning the podium over to Kim Meredith, who will introduce tonight's panelists, I want to say something about the series and the place of this event within it. First, about the series. Why this series? Well, wealth, its production, distribution, and consumption inevitably raises questions about ethics. Some of our society's most pointed debates take place around questions of wealth. What is it? How should it be distributed? What are our obligations to those who don't have it? Does wealth make you happy? Is great wealth compatible with virtue? Different societies have answered these questions in different ways, and this series explores some of their answers, along with what we do know about these questions, what answers we do know from the social sciences. Questions about the role of wealth in public and private life don't always receive enough scrutiny, but wealth intentionally and unintentionally shapes our world and our own lives and demands critical reflection and discussion, and that's the impetus for having this series. As I say, will be a 2-year series, and it's connected to various classes that are being mounted across the campus. Next year, we'll be bringing, among others, Catherine Boo, whose award-winning book Beyond the Beautiful Forevers examines wealth and poverty in a Mumbai slum, and Princeton professor Peter Brown, whose new book Through the Eye of a Needle examines the role of wealth in the fall of Rome and the rise of the West. The series will also be staging a production of An Inspector Calls, J.B. Priestley's scathing criticism of the Victorian class system, and a great mystery play. So please go to the center's website for more information about these events. We hope you'll join us. We want you to be part of the conversation. So that's about the context for the series. Now let me say something about tonight's event, which is co-sponsored with Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Philanthropy raises a great many questions, and a lot has been written and evaluated, and discussion has centered around questions of efficacy, and those will probably come up tonight as well. But philanthropy also raises a host of ethical questions. These include the role of philanthropic institutions in a democracy, their accountability, and their legitimacy. As the government increasingly outsources many of its tasks to both for-profit and nonprofit entities, these questions are of central importance. Private philanthropy is shaping efforts in our schools, in our politics, in our welfare programs, and in the developing world. Rob Reich, who is the faculty director of the program in Ethics in Society, the undergraduate program connected to the center, as well as an associate director of PAX, recently wrote a provocative piece in the Boston Review addressing these questions. The Ethics Center has itself recently entered into collaboration with the Boston Review. You can see links of some of our events on the Boston Review website. Tonight's event also serves jointly as our yearly forum where we take ethical issues probed in the Boston Review and bring them into a wider public discussion. So this event tonight is doing at least double duty as the last event in the Ethics of Wealth series and as the Ethics Center Boston Review collaboration. So with that, I will turn this over to Kim Meredith, who is the executive director of PAX.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We are delighted to be partnering with Ethics in Society on this discussion. I'm Kim Meredith, and I'm Executive Director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And we are a research center where scholars, leaders, and practitioners come together to explore ideas for social change. We are also the publisher of the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So we say that we are in the business of knowledge creation through our research and original content, knowledge sharing through classes, activities such as this, and community building. We are a fully interdisciplinary center, as is Ethics in Society, and we are working with and funding students in 5 schools, that would be humanities and sciences, education, business law, and engineering, 20 departments, and that leads us to over 100 faculty affiliations. We have scaled our budget 6 times in the past 3 years. We've opened an office at the Stanford Center at Peking University, and we are here this evening to share a great conversation with you. We have 3 faculty directors and 1 academic editor. Our 3 faculty directors include Rob Reisch, who I will talk a little bit more about in a moment, Woody Powell, whose research is on evaluation in the nonprofit sector, Paul Brest, who recently joined us after leaving the Hewlett Foundation, and his work is on performance management, and specifically with us on impact investing. And Johanna Mayer, who is our academic editor of SSIR, is leading a broad global research project on social innovation and organizational capacity to innovate. Now this evening, Rob Reisch is coming to you with this incredible article from the Boston Review, What Are Foundations For? But this is part of a discussion that we've had going on now for a good almost 2 years with Rob. He leads a research project called Philanthropy, Policy, and Technology, or our Recoding Good project for the 21st century. And we've been bringing together groups in workshops, or we call them charrettes, and it's a mix of scholars and practitioners, and we have looked at sharing economy, Citizens United, impact investing, big digital public goods, democracy and philanthropy, and use this article as an anchor for that conversation, the philanthropy and the body, and we also hosted with the White House a Good Jobs Hackathon using big government data to actually look at where social sector jobs might be. So this is part of a longer research project that Rob is engaged with Stanford PACS. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context. But for some of you, the concept of philanthropy is new, and you are giving and you think about yourself making a charitable donation, but you don't necessarily think of yourself as a philanthropist, but in fact, you are. Philanthropy can be human capital, intellectual capital, or financial capital. And in fact, in 2011, people like you and me gave almost $300 billion in cash gifts. You additionally gave another 63 million people gave 8.1 billion reported volunteer hours. And if you value that at just $22 an hour, that's another $170 billion. And then there was a recent report that came out from the government indicating that the contribution from the nonprofit sector was approximately 7.8% of our GDP. So the $300 billion, which equals 2% of our GDP, plus that additional $170 billion, plus the output from the nonprofit social sector, it's anywhere from 10 to 13% of our GDP, depending on how you want to look at that. So it's a significant part of what's going on in our society. And in fact, this philanthropy and nonprofit sector employs 10% of the labor force. So again, a big part of what's going on in our domestic economy, and it also has been the fastest area of economic growth in the past year. So where do those philanthropic dollars come from? They come from people like you and me, 71% who are living, 8% who are passing on, so around 83 to 85% in any given year. And then foundations are contributing 14% and corporations 5%. So where does that money go to? Well, from individuals, probably 30% of it, and the 30% on the aggregate or a little bit more, is going to religion. So it's a reminder you can ask early and often, but there's also many other places where you, individual families, who on average are giving about $2,300 a year. So health, education, human services, all of the areas of interest that you actually care about and think about. But foundations have a very unique role. So while they are 14% of that $300 billion, if you will. They play a very special role in that they have $600 billion of unconstrained assets that they hold and have invested. And importantly, they are making grants, and some of those grants are multi-year, and some of them go to general support and some to project-related support. But importantly, they can come in larger gifts. They can signal others, such as you and me, who they may have done more due diligence, and that's helpful for smaller foundations to hear from larger foundations. But importantly, they can play some special roles. They can be a driver of social change, such as the Gates Foundation, that has really looked at malaria up and down, whether it's from bed nets to research. They can be a catalyst for social change. Think about it. In the year 2000, how many of you really talked about carbon footprint? Well, today we do, thanks to the Hewlett Foundation that pulled together foundations in the area, funded Climate Works, and really changed our thinking and was a catalyst for this new thinking and social change work. Or they can be a partner, such as the good partnerships that we enjoyed when we wanted to take over SSIR, and a number of foundations lined up with us and helped us have that opportunity. So they can play this very special role, and so tonight, when you're listening to the commentary from our speakers, and first our keynote, Rob, you can put that into your mindset and your context. So with that, there are some paradoxes that are in the field, I would say. You have grass tops with the money, grassroots, people working on the bottom trying to solve these problems. How do they come together through philanthropy, and what are the roles that the people with money, either individuals or foundations, and those of us who are doing the work maybe within the social sector? So a huge opportunity to have an interesting conversation this evening, and let me now introduce our speakers. These complex social problems actually do require some very complex thinking and critical thinking, and tonight you are going to hear from 4 incredible people. Let me call up to the stage first Chiara Cordelli, who is a Stanford PACS postdoc. She's coming to the end of her 2 years, and we have fought hard to keep her this second year. She was in high demand from a global context and is truly an up-and-coming scholar who has been working with Rob Reich this past 2 years on his research project. Chiara? Next, I'd like to introduce Larry Kramer. Larry served as Dean of Stanford Law School, and in September, on September 1st, took over as the president of the Hewlett Foundation. Larry. And next, we have Susan Liautaud, who has joined us as a visiting scholar this year. She previously was an associate dean at Stanford Law School and has been living and working in London the past 10 years. We have the delight of her participating with our center this year, teaching classes and leading research. Susan? And finally, let me introduce Rob Reich, Stanford PACS faculty co-director, Ethics and Society Program Director, Associate Professor in Political Science with appointments at the School of Education and Philosophy. Rob, thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks to the assembled guests and for you for coming. This is the first time, I think, that 2 of my intellectual homes on campus, the Ethics and Society Center and the PACS Center, have done a joint event where I'm the part of the subject matter of it, so it's exciting for me. It was mentioned that the substance of my remarks will be drawn from an article that came out just about 2 months ago in the Boston Review. It's an article that's available for free online, and I'll go over a few of the points from the article. I won't assume any familiarity with it, but it's easily accessible if you look for it. What I want to note at the start is that my remarks about philanthropy and democracy will focus tonight very particularly on the role that foundations play in a democracy, philanthropic foundations. So you saw the big pie chart of the $300 billion or so given away by Americans last year, and the perhaps surprisingly small percentage of which came from foundations, only about 14%. Now, foundations have, as Kim Meredith mentioned, about $600 billion in assets, so their potential for influence is quite large. But I won't be talking tonight about philanthropy in general. I'll be talking about foundations in particular and how they fit into and can potentially even support a flourishing democratic society. So I want to begin with the simple idea that it's quite possible, I think there's a very good case to be made, that we're living in a second golden age of philanthropy. If the first golden age had something to do with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Ford Foundations of the world, this age in which we have the Gates Foundation and the constant creation of many, many, relatively speaking, large new foundations by relatively speaking young people who still have a long time horizon of operating the foundation, continue to take money and confer it to the foundation. There's a really good case to be made that the new generation of foundations created just in the past, say, 15 years will leave an enduring and lasting mark on American society and globally as well. And I am predicting, although I can't be sure, what your own attitudes are about foundations, but my guess is that you have the attitude that I think most Americans share, which is that philanthropic foundations do very important work in society and across the globe. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are often listed as some of the most admired Americans, and I think that's partly because of their business acumen, but at least as well, significantly, a part of their philanthropic generosity. When I teach Stanford undergraduates, I often form the impression that they believe their dream job would be to go to work for a foundation. Perhaps a startup company is also something that's quite glorified at the moment, but working for a foundation is a sort of dream opportunity. And then, just as a general matter, my guess is that the kind of conventional thought someone has is that someone who makes a lot of money and gives it away to create a foundation in order to give that money away over the course of time is doing something that the only appropriate response to is to be thankful and grateful for their generosity, because of course one relevant alternative would be they could have decided to consume it and to have conspicuous consumption. Relative to the possibility of buying a second or third or fourth house and another yacht, as opposed to creating a foundation, the person who creates a foundation is doing something that's praiseworthy. So I'm sure that there is something to these conventional ideas, that philanthropists are admirable, they do good work, foundations do good work, that working for a foundation would be a dream job, and that the one appropriate attitude to someone who creates a foundation is gratitude. But what I want to do is try to complicate the picture a bit and show how there's a potential uneasiness or lack of fit between the work that foundations do in the context of a flourishing democratic society. And so in order to try to tease out some intuitions that you might not think you have, if in fact you think the appropriate attitude is something like gratitude, to try to tease out some of the intuitions you have that will at least raise some skepticism to the surface, what I want to do is just share three short stories, three short anecdotes to try to tug out some skepticism that you might have. Okay, so the first one comes from Diane Ravitch, a prominent observer and critic of education reform in the United States, and an especially acerbic critic of the Gates Foundation and other foundations which have aligned themselves with the Gates Foundation in their education reform efforts. So Diane Ravitch, she has one of the responses in the Boston Review in which she says something to the effect that it's an unusual thing for some of the largest foundations that are making gifts in the realm of education policy, first to coordinate their agendas so that we have not idiosyncratic approaches of many different foundations trying different things out, but a coordinated agenda amongst large foundations who are all trying out the same controversial education reform policies. And then to be doing it in such a way with the significance of the dollars they have available that they're championing something that is not universally thought to be a beneficial or a good form of education reform. There's genuine controversy about the kinds of policies that involve evaluating the relative effectiveness of teachers, championing a kind of charter school, a charter management approach. Not everyone shares the same opinions about reform. And so Diane Ravitch's view is that whereas if the superintendents of the school district were carrying this out and there was discontent with it, you could decide not to elect the school superintendent in the next election. Whereas if the Secretary of Education was carrying this out, you could decide to send a signal to Washington, D.C. by electing a different representative who would communicate your views about policy, education policy, in the right channels. If your mayor was in favor of this, you could decide not to vote the mayor in the next time around and get someone in who is more in tune with your approach. But Bill Gates is not subject to any form of electoral accountability, nor is any foundation. So Diane Ravitch's line is that Bill Gates is the nation's unelected school superintendent, and we should think that that's a problem. Second anecdote. From a very different point on the political spectrum, the following view comes from Judge Richard Posner on the different side of the spectrum. So I'm just going to quote from him. He's observing here what he thinks is a problem with the idea that a foundation is legally designed to exist in perpetuity. The foundation is designed to extend beyond the life of the donor that set it up, and the assets in the endowment are expected to last in principle forever. He writes the following: a perpetual charitable foundation is a completely irresponsible institution, answerable to nobody. It competes neither in capital markets nor in product markets, and unlike a hereditary monarch whom such a foundation otherwise resembles, it is subject to no political controls either. It's not even subject to benchmark competition, that is, evaluation by comparison with similar enterprises, except with regard to the percentage of its expenditures that go to administration, staff salaries and the like, rather than to donees. The puzzle for an economist is why these foundations are not total scandals. Close quote. That's right, Judge Posner. Third anecdote. This comes from a book in 2000 by an investigative journalist named Mark Dowie, who went looking around at the practices, the inside life of a bunch of foundations. And he relates in his book, American Foundations, the following instructive anecdote about George Soros's Open Society Foundations. So during a meeting to resolve a disagreement about grant-making priorities that the Soros Foundation would have, Soros is alleged to have announced amongst the conversation of his staffers, people who worked for the foundation, the following: look, folks, this is my money, so we're going to do it my way. At which point, a junior staff member is alleged to have interjected that Mr. Soros, roughly half of the money in the foundation is not yours, but is the public's money, because it would have been placed, if you hadn't given the money away to the foundation, about half of it would have been subject to taxation and would be in the Treasury. At which point, Mark Dowie reports that the junior staffer was soon relieved of his employment. So the point of view here, of course, is that foundations are not the mere product of the liberty of wealthy people to give money away, but they're generously tax-subsidized institutional entities. Foundations are the product of our collective decision to diminish the tax burden that would otherwise apply to a wealthy person who decides to give money away, and to diminish their tax burden in return for setting up a foundation. Charitable giving, all charitable giving, last year cost the US Treasury roughly $50 billion. That would have been collected in taxation had people not given money away. Okay, so those are three anecdotes just intended to pull out some potentially skeptical intuitions. Now what I want to do in a very short amount of time is just rehearse the structure of this article I've written, What Are Foundations For?, in order to show you first, the first half of the article builds out reasons for you to have even more skepticism that foundations could be thought to be really great things in a democratic society. And the second half is a bit of redemption, where I offer some arguments to say that foundations do indeed have a fulsome and important role to play in democracies, and I try to describe the reasons for that and the standards that we might hold foundations to in order that they would actually do justice to the particular role that they are intended to play, what foundations are for. Intended here as a philosophical argument, not as a legal specification. Okay, so as should probably be obvious, my orientation here is as a political theorist or a political philosopher. I'm trying to think as sort of from first principles. If we were designing a democratic society from scratch and we were thinking to ourselves, well, we want to figure out how we're going to make democracy go really well, I then want to think about the particular features of a foundation, the institutional design of what a foundation is and how it's codified into law, and ask you to wonder, if you were a democratic designer creating democratic society from scratch, would you create the particular institutional form that is a foundation? I wonder whether or not you think you would. My claim, I think an uncontroversial claim, is that foundations, the form of a foundation, is an institutional oddity, a very strange creation in a democratic society. A foundation is a permanent, donor-directed, tax-advantaged private endowment, a portion of which is distributed annually for a public purpose. So let me go through 4 features, legal features, of what a foundation is. I think these are relatively, I mean this just as a description, not as a contestable argument. 4 features, and then will come the redemption of a foundation in a few minutes. So feature number 1, foundations are, relatively speaking, unaccountable institutions. They don't compete in the marketplace, as Judge Posner suggested. So when you create a foundation, you don't have to worry about competitors putting you out of business because you have nothing for sale. But to the contrary, you're giving money away. So there's no marketplace competition. There's no consumer who can decide not to purchase your product anymore and therefore put pressure on you. Someone can decide not to take a grant from you, although you can imagine why that's, relatively speaking, unlikely if you're offering them a grant. So there's no marketplace accountability. Similarly, as Diane Ravage's point is, there's no democratic or electoral accountability. If you don't like what the Gates Foundation is doing with respect to health policy or education policy, or for that matter, you don't like what the Hewlett Foundation is doing with respect to any of its policy areas, you can write a letter to Larry Kramer expressing your discontent, but you can't unelect Larry Kramer. You can't unelect the board of trustees that governs the Hewlett Foundation. It's not subject to democratic accountability. So the accountability structure is designed quite purposefully to leave the foundation, relatively speaking, unaccountable. In addition, there's what you might call a kind of sociological point about what life is like working for a foundation. What the kind of feedback loops you can imagine you get if you're a program officer or a president of a foundation. Now, I haven't been one, so I'll defer to Larry Kramer's experience or anyone else in the audience who's been a program officer or a president of a foundation, what this is like. But I'm told the general experience is something that suddenly, after becoming the foundation person, you become a much better looking and interesting person in social circumstances, because people are effectively supplicants at every turn looking for a grant dollar. Your grantees don't have a really robust incentive to give you honest feedback because they're dependent upon you for a grant down the road. Similarly, people who aren't your grantees are potentially looking for a grant, so are disinclined to criticize you as well. So leaving aside the formal accountability mechanisms that don't apply, no marketplace accountability, no electoral accountability, just the interior forms of accountability that you might think are desirable within any type of organization are really hard to get up and running in a foundation because by and large, everyone thinks what you're doing is great. Second point, there's really low transparency requirements for foundations. Foundations are required to file every year what's known as a 990 form. It's a tax return, which gives some basic information about the amount of money they have, their employees and what they're paid, where they've given money away. But foundations are not obligated to have a website. They're not obligated to announce any type of grant-giving strategy. They're not obligated ever to announce anything in public beyond this tax form. So foundations really can operate sort of in the shadows unless you were so motivated to get their tax form that you could get some just basic information about their operations. Some foundations, of course, prefer to operate as much as possible in the public, but that's an idiosyncratic decision of the foundation, not anything required by law. If you want as a foundation to have a name which communicates nothing about what you do, doesn't even convey what the name of your family is, you can pick any name you want. Again, no website, no mailing address necessarily, no articulation of a grant-making strategy. You can really just decide to be in the background. Third point, foundations are designed, as I said before, to exist potentially in perpetuity. So the line here that lawyers often give is that the dead hand of the donor extends out of the grave across generations. When a foundation is set up, American law and most philanthropic law really does protect donor intent. So the intent of the donor is crucial and extends even beyond the life of the donor when it's put into a place within a foundation. So foundations can live forever, in principle, always hewing to, legally required to hew to, the intent of the donor. Now, some foundations, like the Hewlett Foundation, have a relatively broad mission set up by the donor, so the donor's intent was to have a relatively speaking broad mission. Other donors create foundations with very specific, narrow missions that can't be abridged by law because the law protects donor intent even after death. And finally, as the Mark Dowie point was meant to illustrate, foundations are not merely the exercise of the liberty of wealthy people to give money away and to put them into a foundation. Foundations are significantly tax-subsidized entities. And it's an open question whether or not they would exist without the existence of these subsidies. Many people try to find natural experiments to test how important is the existence of tax incentives to people's decisions to give money away. The Carnegies and Rockefellers of the world, of course, set up foundations before there were income taxes. So strictly speaking, they didn't have a tax break to set up a foundation. And it's an interesting question whether or not people would create foundations in the numbers and in the amount that they do today without tax breaks. My point is not to speculate about that. It's quite likely, it seems to me, that in the absence of tax incentives, there would be less philanthropic money available. The point I wish to make here is that we shouldn't think that all of the money in foundations is the donor's money in the first place. Some of the money in the foundation was money that would otherwise have been tax revenue had people not given the money away. Okay, you can see I've tried to give you reasons to be skeptical, that if we have a unaccountable, non-transparent, existing in perpetuity, donor-directed, tax-subsidized entity called a foundation, we should think that, yeah, that's something we want in a democracy, because what we've done is we created an institutional form responsive to plutocratic voices or preferences, the preferences of the wealthy. Foundations are virtually by definition the expression of preferences of wealthy people. The wealthier you are, the bigger the voice you have through a foundation. Why would we think that that sits easily within a democratic society which is committed, at least in principle, to the idea of equal opportunity for political influence? All right, let me try and now give you some reasons to think foundations do fit well within society, and then I'll wrap up, and I really look forward to hearing the comments. I want to give you two arguments about why it is that foundations are not merely compatible with democracy, but can sustain and enhance democracy. The first argument I'll call the argument from pluralism, and the second argument I'll call the argument from discovery. So first about pluralism. What foundations can do that democratically elected representatives can't is begin to diminish the amount of government orthodoxy in both the definition of what's publicly beneficial or a public good and the distribution of whatever is decided as publicly beneficial or good. In particular, think about it this way. If you decide you want to have money spent on a public policy program to your liking, and you want to use tax money for it, you have to assemble a majority of representatives who will then pass legislation authorizing the expenditure of public dollars. If you can't assemble a majority, democracy means you don't get to have your preference about that particular issue funded by the public purse. So people who have consistently minority preferences about what they wish for public spending to go to will not find their preferences represented in a democratic system very often because they can't assemble the majority that's required to authorize the expenditure of funds. Foundations are a way of decentralizing some of the authority to spend money on unpopular, divisive, minority, or controversial causes. It's a way to diminish government orthodoxy in the definition and provision of public goods. This argument from pluralism turns a foundation's lack of marketplace and electoral accountability from a defect into a virtue. Foundations are free, unlike commercial entities, to fund public goods because they need not compete with other firms or exclude people from consuming the goods they fund. And they're free, unlike politicians who face future elections, to fund minority, experimental, or controversial public goods that are not favored by majorities. So foundations can be pluralism-enhancing mechanisms so that certain public goods that we would predict are unlikely to be funded by our democratic representatives do get funded nevertheless through foundations. Second argument, the argument from discovery. The phrase that you may be familiar with is the idea that foundations represent the risk capital of a democratic society. So what I mean by discovery is the following. Let's say a democracy wishes to advance the general welfare or pursue the aims of justice, but our democratic representatives don't know the very best means for achieving those aims. What kinds of policies will best promote educational opportunity and achievement? Well, perhaps universal preschool is the mechanism. Others might think a completely new way of funding of school finance is the answer. Others might think we can get better educational television or online learning in order to do it. So we have a competition of ideas that are all harnessed around a worthy aim, expanding educational opportunity and achievement, with uncertainty about which would be a better and worse aim. We can think of similar controversies or uncertainty across a whole bunch of different policy domains. Now, to answer these questions, then, a democratic society, recognizing that its leaders are not all-knowing, that reasonable disagreement on the best means to pursue just ends is likely, and that social conditions are always evolving, might wish to stimulate experimentation in social policy so that better and more effective policies at realizing democratically agreed upon aims can be identified and then adopted. So foundations, in this respect, can be assets deployed for social policy innovation and experimentation, partly at private cost, the dollars of the donor, partly at public cost, the tax subsidy that assists in setting up the foundation, directed at social policy innovation. This might be a really ingenious mechanism for decentralizing and creating a large number of experiments in social policy, allowing the best of which to bubble up to the surface and then be brought to scale, be rolled out on a broader basis, either by the state itself or perhaps if it's a commercial opportunity, by a for-profit company. This experimentation in a democracy is never ending. In light of constant change in economic, cultural, technological, and generation conditions, the discovery process is in ideal circumstances cumulative, contributing to society a storehouse of best or simply very effective practices for different contexts and shifting priorities. Foundations are one device for implementing in society this systematic policy of stimulating discovery and experimentation and innovation in policy so that better rather than worse policies can be presented to the democratic authorities or elected officials for consideration, and not all of them carried out by the democratic offices themselves. And really crucially here, foundations, because of their lack of accountability, have a long time horizon. They can take a 10-year or a 20-year gamble on social policy experimentation without knowing whether it'll pay off. The idea that a democratic elected representative can say there's going to be a lot of upfront investment, the next couple years of spending are going to be high, and we won't know whether there's any return at all for 10 years, is a recipe to make every elected representative nervous, because they need to show their constituents that they've done something with public funds over a relatively short time horizon. That's the point of electoral accountability in a way. Similarly with the for-profit marketplace, they have investors to please over a short time horizon. The stock market or angel investors don't allow sort of unending long time horizon experimentation. Eventually, the return on investment has to come. Foundations, because of their lack of accountability, can go long, can take this longer time horizon. And that's an asset when it comes to social policy experimentation. So, the way I want to conclude is by saying, I think that foundations can indeed play a role not merely consistent with democracy, but supportive of democracy, in part because they can be pluralism enhancing, and in part, I think in larger part, because they can play a really important role in discovery, in the discovery of more effective rather than less effective social policies. That ought to be the standard by which we hold foundations accountable. If it turns out that foundations don't think long, do not engage in policy experimentation, or they're very risk averse as a general matter, then I would say they don't deserve these institutional protections they have. And I'd offer as a final way of thinking about that, an analogy to a realm, if you come from here in the university, ought to be familiar to you. Why is it that scholars or professors at university deserve the institutional protection of tenure, which is no accountability structure whatsoever after getting tenure? If you think that tenure is justifiable, one reason you might think it's justifiable is that it allows people who are subject to peer norms, that's what peer review involves, are set up to take long time horizon, risky scholarly investments. If I want to spend 10 years scanning the world to become the world's expert on some particular species, or I want to engage in a philosophical project of exploration that I have no idea whether it will pay out in the end, I have the permission to do so, because when I submit my annual report to Dean Satz next year, she can't decide to fire me because I've been unproductive, if I have tenure. If you think this is a way to get up and running an argument about tenure, and it turns out that professors as a general matter do risk-averse, short time horizon, small ball research, never taking long time horizons into account, you might think the worse for them, they don't deserve the protection of tenure. Similarly, if foundations do risk-averse, short time horizon, small things, then they might not deserve the protections that a foundation gives them. So, with that, I'll stop and turn it over to my discussants. Thank you. Chiara.
So first of all, let me thank Rob for writing a really excellent and thought-provoking paper about the very important question of what the role of philanthropic foundation in a democracy should be, or perhaps more precisely, is there any distinctive role of the foundation can play in a democracy that would justify at least part of those incentives and advantages and privileges that foundations enjoy. Let me begin by confess that I'm skeptical about whether foundations are necessary for democracy. And by this I mean that we could imagine reasonably well-functioning democratic societies where foundations play a very minimal role. For example, this is still the case of society like Ireland or France in Europe. And I would not argue that because of the lack of foundation in this society are less democratic, say, than the US. I also agree with Rob that foundations represent a powerful threat to democratic values. One fundamental value in a democracy, as Rob mentioned, is equality of opportunity for political influence. So some citizens are not to have more opportunities to influence political debate just because they are wealthier. And of course, foundation, by constituting concentration of money in the hand of few and state-sponsored concentration of money that could be used indirectly to engage in all sorts of political advocacy activity, pose a certain type of plutocratic threat to democracy. So I agree with Rob on this. I, however, also agree with Rob that foundation can play a positive and distinctive role of in a democracy. So the question here is really how we define this role. I think in this respect, my view departs in certain ways from Rob's arguments, although our view shares many things. First, I'm much more skeptical about whether pluralism, appeal to pluralism and diversity can play any role at all in justify the existence of foundations in a democracy. I think first that our love for pluralism should not be unconditional. Of course, a liberal democratic society ought to respect all points of view, including illiberal ones. And I think it's very important, as Rob mentioned, to foster a decentralized system that somehow can challenge, in certain respect, government orthodoxy in the distribution and delivery of goods and services. So that individuals can privately fund goods and services that government underproduce or only provide according to majority preferences. However, I think that government orthodoxies is not always bad. It's really bad in cases, for example, of distribution of goods, such say the arts. We certainly do not want a government to provide, to decide what kind of arts should be supported or fostered in a society. But it seems to me that government orthodoxy, for example, is not as bad in the case of provision of goods such as basic education, if we want children to become responsible citizens and to have equal chances of thriving in life. A society has an interest in this case of limiting pluralism, I think, in the delivery of education, and try as far as possible to provide children with roughly equal kind of basic education. So pluralism is not always good or as good for all type of goods, and as a consequence also philanthropy is not as good, equally good for all type of goods as an alternative mechanism of provision. But leaving aside when or what kind of pluralism is valuable, the question here is our foundation is a part of the distinctive role of foundation to foster valuable pluralism. And my answer is, I don't think so, because if really is pluralism what we want to foster, a traditional individual type of philanthropy as opposed as an to an institutionalized type of philanthropy seems to me is a better means of fostering pluralism. Individuals should be free and perhaps should receive some incentives to give to the associations they care about so as to provide goods according to their preferences. So I think that philanthropy, traditional philanthropy, rather than foundations, better foster pluralism. I also think the foundation could threaten pluralism because they aggregate money in the hands of few, and sometimes also they tend to impose donors' views on their grantees. So I would not share the pluralist argument. Instead, I am much more sympathetic to Rob's discovery argument, so the idea that foundations, because of their peculiar long-term and flexible and adaptable structure, can play a very distinctive role in experimenting and fostering innovation by investing in risky activities. However, whether this should be the only or prominent role of foundation in a society, I think it's a matter of contention. And in this respect, I think I would like to propose perhaps not an alternative, but a different way of looking at the role of foundation that somehow incorporate the discovery argument, but recognize its contingency and describe the role of foundation beyond experimentation and innovation. And a way of doing that, I think, is thinking about foundation as what I would call reserve funds for democracy. So a reserve fund is usually an account that an individual business can set aside to respond to unexpected failures or unexpected costs. And I think that similarly, foundation could be regarded as accounts that individuals responding to substantial political incentives could set aside to eventually respond to social failures. And this is the public good aspects of foundations. So the question then becomes, what are the social failures foundation should respond to? And I think this is a question, as a matter of contingency. I think in American democracy, now there are, as in all countries, several social failures, but I'm going to concentrate on two. The first is the presence of large political inequalities. The voice of some citizens is much more powerful than the voice of others in the public sphere. And this is particularly true after Citizens United, where corporations are allowed to spend as much as they want in political advocacy. So the risk is that business and corporations colonize the public sphere by suffocating weaker groups' voices. And so I think One role of foundations are reserve funds is to respond to this kind of social failure by, for example, funding and bringing together a grassroots organization that can voice the interest of weaker and unrepresented groups. But of course, political inequality always persists if there are large social economic inequalities in the background. So I think another role of some foundation as reserve funds for democracy would be to try and do something, especially when government fails to promote social justice, and so to be more redistributive in their activity by prioritizing in their grant-making activities no-profits that serve the needy and the destitute. And finally, and this is my last point, I think there is also another social failure that foundation can play a distinctive role in responding or counteracting, which is a prevalent culture of short-termism. So governments, and this is not only something that pertains to the American government, but in this case, the problem is that under pressure for the next election cycle, and given the polarized political culture, the tendency is for government always to prevail kind of short-term safe goals rather than investing in risk long-term goals. And this has not always been the case. I think we don't have to think that government cannot risk more. In fact, we would not have social security system and railroads if government were always afraid to risk. So I think government should risk more. But as long as they are unwilling to do so, I think the foundation, because of their long-term lifespan, can play a very important role in counteracting short-termism by making long-term risk investments. And I think we need now this investment, especially in policy areas like the environment. So for example, foundation can play an important role in funding technology or projects that aim at find strategies or developing technologies to reduce or offset carbon emission and lead others to do the same. And so I think in this respect, foundation can play a very important role, although this, and I think this is a very important point, the fact that foundation ought to respond to social failure is not justification for government to fail, of course, in the first instance. So foundation should not be used by government as excuses not to risk what they should.
Great. Larry, right? Susan.
Okay. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Deborah and Kim, for this privilege. Well, I'm not a political theorist, so I learned a lot from Rob's positioning of foundations within a democratic system and from Chiara's remarks. So I think listening to this, I'm going to try to focus a little bit on this question of accountability, but to maybe stretch it outside the contours of the article a little bit. And I should just start by saying that I don't think the point is to say that all foundations are accountable or not. There are highly accountable foundations and there are poorly accountable foundations, just as there are individual philanthropists and even corporate social responsibility programs. My own view is that this accountability needs to be very much a proactive, voluntary exercise, and that it needs to go not only to donors and to the public, but also to beneficiaries and program outcomes and the communities in which foundations operate. So the first area I'd like to emphasize is that I think this accountability is very relevant in a democracy, but it extends beyond political system boundaries. So many of the foundations that are sort of the target population of this article are highly active in non-democratic societies. And one of the most prominent examples is Bill Gates, who hails from Pakistan when addressing the international media on polio, and then goes on to Ghana with the Gavi Vaccine Initiative, and then tours Africa, as Kim mentioned, for his malaria programs, and then on to China to address ultra-high net worth individuals to market his brand of philanthropy. So I think his accountability obligations are the same, whether it's in Pakistan or in Ghana or in Seattle. And there are many smaller foundations that also indirectly influence through gifts to NGOs and in other ways that are less visible than, for example, Gates Foundation. Second, drilling down just a little bit, I think that similar analysis applies to rule of law. Many of the foundations operate in areas where rule of law isn't what it is in the US. Some of these are democracies, like India is a parliamentary democracy, but we've seen highly democratic processes like millions of people demonstrating on behalf of the rape victim on the streets of Delhi with freedom of speech, and yet rape laws that have been on the books for decades are not enforced. Other parts of the world, Western Africa, I don't think many of us think there's much rule of law in places like Equatorial Guinea or the Sudan. But irrespective of that, even a US foundation's accountability obligations, I think, really are the same anywhere they function in the world. One nuance to that, I would say, is that I believe that threat of additional law or additional regulation does influence US and Western European foundations and the nonprofit sector generally to try to raise their game. And presumably in a rule of law environment, that the threat of new law or new laws on accountability is a little bit more powerful, because if it's not going to be enforced, that threat doesn't have much bite. But beyond that, I think, again, these accountability obligations are really proactive and irrespective of rule of law. Third, I'd like to say that one of the things I really liked about the article is that it forces us to look at foundations beyond the fact that they're simply institutions and to actual outcomes. What is the purpose of this institution? Because I think all too often we look at institutions as an end game. And in fact, whether it's foundations or other philanthropic institutions like venture philanthropy funds or benefit corporations, they exist to serve an outcome. They're not really meant to be the ends in themselves. And I think one way to sort of strengthen that analysis might be to say, to take this very comprehensive profile of foundations as a player that Rob has given us and flip the analysis on its head and look at it from the point of view of the problems in which these foundations engage. And so Diane Ravitch did it a little bit with education. Deborah Fung, in her commentary, did it a little bit with homelessness. But my point today isn't to say I want to get into the substance of any particular issue, but rather that most of these societal issues require a constellation of players to achieve a sustainable solution. So whether it is government or academic institutions or business, or whether in some cases it's the multilateral organizations or even the military, and in my view, almost always individual members of civil society, and that might be a volunteer at the Boys and Girls Clubs in East Palo Alto, and that might be a fruit vendor committing self-immolation in Tahrir Square. Foundations need to also be accountable to the other players in society and not sort of suck all the oxygen out of the room, but rather be aware that these other players need space to engage in their best way, and that we should be looking at comprehensive, inclusive solutions to problems. And I think one manifestation of this particular side of accountability is monopolizing a particular issue. Mm-hmm. And we tend to see it in the news with big names. We see it with names like Gates and Soros. But really it's, I think, a relative question, because a relatively small amount of money can monopolize an issue. A relatively small amount of money can monopolize programs at a local public library for the elderly, for example. So I think it's a question, again, about just being accountable, in addition to all of the others that I mentioned at the beginning, to the other players. And then finally, I think one point where we may have slight disagreement is that I think accountability is always something that we should expect and demand, even if it is a proactive responsibility. And I don't think we should ever say that it's okay to have lower standards of accountability on the basis of the intrinsic characteristics of a particular foundation. So for example, I may have misunderstood one part of the article, but I think I understood that if foundations are higher risk, you're more comfortable with lower standards of accountability. I personally think that high accountability and high risk can coexist. We have highly accountable hedge funds. We have very poorly accountable soup kitchens. I think we should be demanding the highest standards of accountability, irrespective of the level of risk or the programmatic or grant-making activities of the foundation. And similarly on size, I think while the mechanics of accountability might differ between, say, the Hewlett Foundation and a $1 million family foundation, the general principles of first-in-class accountability should apply. And then I guess I'll just finish by saying that I think accountability is something different from ethics, but since this is an event with ethics in society, because we don't have a legal system, and I don't think we should have a legal system that regulates every aspect of first-in-class accountability. I think overly prescriptive law would not be enforceable, it would not be efficient, and it would not be productive. But because we have this need for proactive accountability, I think accountability, while separate from ethics, becomes an ethical question. Because foundations that do not proactively seek to be accountable in all the ways I described, I think fail ethically.
Yeah, just one point of clarification, and in the discussion after Larry goes, it'd be great to work this out a bit more. Higher risk goes with lower forms of accountability. I mean, yes, I think that is part of the point I'm trying to make. Relative to marketplace accountability, where we're harnessing the accountability structure to an investor or the stock market, and democratic accountability, where we have regularly scheduled elections so that the constituencies can hold their elected representatives accountable. What I mean by the lack of accountability for foundations, so if Peter Thiel says, you know what, I made a lot of money, seasteading is my idea about what's really important for democratic societies to work on. I might think, Chiara might think, that's a waste of philanthropic capital, given all the other opportunities out there. And Peter Thiel can say, essentially, bully for you that you have that view, and I'm going to cheerfully go on my merry way. I don't mean to pick on Peter Thiel here. Anyone's eccentric idea in a foundation is given legal permission, absent anyone else's view about whether it's a good idea or not. That's what makes them unaccountable, relatively speaking, and what permits them to take a long time horizon and a high-risk set of investments.
Okay, so I have, I guess, a few different points. A lot of this will go over some of the ground that's been gone over, although I want to sort of give it my own spin. It's going to be a little messy now, because as everybody kept talking, I kept thinking how I wanted to do that. So first, I should say, I do, as Rob knows, I start from a slightly different place in thinking about the problem. I don't actually think it's helpful to frame the issue as if you were designing a democracy from scratch, would you have foundations? Because you're never designing a democracy from scratch. No one's ever designed a democracy from scratch. I mean, you're never designing an ideal system, and so to me it doesn't really make sense to think through the problem that way. You're always living in a world where you're starting with a whole bunch of second and third best imperfections, and then asking, okay, how did this institution emerge and what role does it serve within that? So for instance, if you ask the question, in an ideal democracy, would you create foundations? But every other institution isn't what you would get in an ideal democracy either. The legislature isn't close, the executive isn't close, I'll come back to the judiciary in a minute, then it's not really a reasonable question. The question you want to be asking is, well, in this democracy, the one that we have, is there a role for foundations that makes sense? And that's essentially the same thing as asking, how did these come about and what do they do and does it make sense to think about the role that they play? Now, there's still lots of room for theorizing, but you're always theorizing within some existing system and asking, given the ends that we're trying to achieve and the way in which the institutions we have are achieving them, is this one serving a useful purpose? And so I would say I basically do agree with Rob on the role that foundations can play affirmatively and also on how to think about what the constraints ought to be in thinking about what that role is. I do want to say, though, that I do not think it's because we're not accountable, and I wasn't going to talk about this, but I will. It's an interesting thing. Rob spells it out. He says, look at what these foundations do. You get this founder, and he writes this thing where he sets out what it's going to be forever, and then you have these later boards, and they interpret this thing, and they apply it, and they're not accountable to anybody either. And isn't that outrageous? And I'm sitting there thinking, actually, that kind of sounds like the Constitution and the judiciary. In fact, it is the Constitution and the judiciary, which I should say, for me, makes it quite ironic to get this from Judge Posner, who is, of course, an Article III judge who sits there completely unaccountable, interpreting texts, subject to nobody, and imposing those values on all of the rest of us. Now, here's the thing. The reason it doesn't bother me, ultimately, when I think about it more is because, in fact, the judiciary is quite accountable. There's a huge literature on the ways in which the judiciary is accountable, and foundations are actually accountable in much the same way. Judges are held accountable by essentially two things. One is they do actually exist within a world where reputations matter. They write these opinions, everybody's looking at them, they're criticizing them, they're getting pushback all the time from the relevant parties, and there's a huge body of empirical literature that they are actually quite responsive to this. And then second, there actually does hang over their heads the threat of action by the legislature or the executive. It's happened from time to time. I wrote about this, by the way, before I became a foundation person. It's happened from time to time in American history, and the mere threat of it is actually the same thing as, what's the difference between they've passed the law that says you must do something, or they might pass the law that says you must do something. In either case, if you're afraid of what will happen if you don't do it, that's the form of accountability. And so the one thing I want to say is, what is it that we mean when we say accountable? We mean that you're actually not completely free to do whatever you want, but you're constrained by something that someone else might do to you. And then the question is, well, who might that be? Who would do it, right? And so here it turns out actually that it's the public at large. And I can tell you, I said when I wrote the thing for Rob Thing, I said, I've discovered all sorts of freedoms that I didn't used to have as a foundation presidency. The thing about people thinking I'm better, I don't know if they think I'm better looking, but they certainly do seem to think I'm smarter. And that actually is pretty true. But I do not feel unaccountable by any stretch. I feel I'm constantly watching and concerned about what we're doing and how it will be received by the audience of beneficiaries, by the public at large, by the state and national legislatures, and so on. Now, in an earlier conversation, Rob said to me, yeah, but that kind of accountability is bad because it cuts against the good things that foundations can do. But of course, that's the kind of accountability that everybody's pushing for. That's political accountability. Marketplace accountability, I think, would be even worse. And the way I think about it is something like the following. When you do think about constructing a democratic government, and here I'm not saying you should resort to ideal theory, but we're always balancing independence and accountability. All of the branches of government have some share of independence and some share of accountability. Right? The House of Representatives is the most accountable, direct election every 2 years, but it's every 2 years, and during that 2 years they have a fair amount of freedom to act, and there's all sorts of incumbent advantages, so there's a lot of independence as well. Senators are still more independent relative to their accountability because of the long terms. President's still more, larger electorate, electoral college and all that. The judiciary the most, right? So, and it's the same thing for foundations. So the question we need to be asking is not our foundations accountable, or is there formal accountability in the form of some piece of legislation? It's an empirical question, which is on the ground. Are we comfortable with the balance of independence and accountability that we see foundations actually are able to exercise in the world that we have? And I don't have an answer to that right here. I mean, that's a different debate, but it requires a lot more analysis than simply looking at the formal structures and saying you're not accountable under those technical formal structures. That aside, as I say, I tend to agree with Rob, even coming at it the way I do, that, what is the role that foundations have grown up to play? And it's because, look, there are some well-known, systematically demonstrated shortcomings with democratic government, right? Democratic governments are systematically lousy at experimenting. They're lousy at taking risks. They're lousy at investing in the development of evidence. And they're really lousy at thinking for the long term. I mean, we know that to be the case. It's one of the downsides. It's why, as our problems, I should say, require more development of evidence and longer term solutions, democratic government is struggling a little bit everywhere in the world. So a good role for foundations, and the one that they have assumed over time, is sort of filling in because of our relative balance of accountability and independence, in a good position to experiment, to take risks, to develop evidence, and in thinking about it, think for the long term. And here, for me, I would not separate the argument from pluralism and the argument from what Rob called discovery, or I would think of as experimentalism. To me, they're actually the same thing, right? That is to say, the pluralism that we should encourage in the foundation and philanthropic world is an aspect of experimentalism, because you want lots of different kinds of experiments out there. You want people trying all sorts of different kinds of things. You want people who start from different positions and with different views able to push experiments to promote their view. There's a huge difference, I've learned, between the way conservatives think about philanthropy and the way liberals do, for instance. And I think it's a good thing then to have both liberal and conservative foundations, say, pushing different kinds of solutions for education and experimenting and developing the evidence, and it provides, a better system for the society as a whole. So I think it's important that we have a pluralistic system out there, which means, and this goes to some of the contemporary debates, we should have foundations that use different methodologies, that use different structures, that use different approaches to philanthropy, and that have different degrees of longevity. I mean, now the current fad is all the new billionaires, they want to spend down right away because, of course, and they have reasons, and they make sense to me, but there's something that's also gained by having the long-term in perpetuity institutional philanthropies, and we should have a mix of that, and that serves the kinds of interests that Rob is talking about. So the last thing that I want to talk about is what follows from that. I do think are some important implications for how we work, and whether these are instituted in formalistic law or simply part of what ought to be our self-understanding if we think through why are we here and what justifies us being here, which shouldn't require some sort of legal thing. I think there are things that follow. So the first one, which a couple people have touched on, is transparency. I think transparency is critical, and it's critical on both sides. That is to say, it's critical for the experimentalist aspect. We're learning stuff. We have to share what we're learning with the rest of the world so that they don't waste their resources redoing the things that we've done. And it's critical for the kind of reputational accountability that I think it is good for us and is good for the system as a whole. So if we're hiding what we're doing and what we're doing badly, or what we're doing well for that matter, we don't get the right kind of reward system. So, and for what it's worth, the Hewlett, Paul's not here. The Hewlett Foundation under Paul became and is, I think, one of the most, if not the most transparent foundation, one of the most, let's just say one of the most. I don't know if I can make the broader statement. And yet it's still, from my perspective, when I came in, way short of what it ought to be. And that was largely because, as with so many things, transparency we started from a non-transparent position, and it was sort of as things came up, it's like, well, we can share this, we can share that. So I put together a task force in the foundation that right now is analyzing. I said, look, let's do this the other way. Start from the assumption that 100% of what we have is out there. We're going to reveal everything. Now, go through and show me the things that we should take out and give me a reason. And if there's a good reason to pull something out, as there are for some things, then we won't make those, but everything should otherwise be available. And I think we have both reasons in mind. Second, a lot of the conversation, I should say, before I get to the second point, Rob's beef, if you think about it, is not with foundations. It's with aggregations of wealth. It's with rich people, right? No, I mean, a lot of people have this problem, right? I say people with large aggregations of wealth, by virtue of that large aggregation of wealth, are able to exercise more, influence and weight in what happens in society than those of us who don't have large aggregations of wealth. And whether it's a foundation or just, the Koch brothers with a lot of money on their own, doesn't really matter to that, right? And I mention that because, and I should say, the comeback is, yeah, but foundations are even worse because they're tax subsidized. Right? Except so are the rich, right? So are the wealthy. I mean, where do you think that aggregation of wealth came from? There's 1 million tax subsidies that are built into the system to enable people to grow and then retain large aggregations of wealth and use it as they see fit. That's the whole tax system, right? In some ways, there's no real baseline here to think about, like what would be a natural system of taxation. We don't know what that is. So all of these aggregations of wealth, whether it's in the form of a foundation or in the form of just a wealthy person who got it all through capital gains, and so on, is government subsidized to some extent, and they're using that wealth to, do things that those of us without wealth can't exactly do. Now, with that said, then, I think the issue is really focused on its influence in public policy. So once one recognizes there's no real baseline, the provision of straight up charity, I find it hard to object to that very much, I mean, the problem becomes acute when somebody is doing something with that wealth that is not just what they're choosing to do with their money, help poor people eat or buy a lot of boats, but rather is affecting what the rest of the government does. Right? That's really the Gates example with school. That's what had Dan Ravitch so upset, is that what the Gates did was, by virtue of the way they used their money, they affected the way the government spent. And so it was a much broader, and that is a real issue, something we need to think about.
And that's the announced aspiration of many foundations. Let's figure out how to leverage our private assets to change public policy.
It's a big part of what we do. And I should say, no, I'm not going to, I don't want to beat up on the Gates Foundation. I had an interesting, okay, I'm going to do this very quickly. I was at an interesting meeting with people on family planning. And the Gates Foundation, as you know, has also announced a huge family planning effort. And they came in and single-handedly quintupled except for what's called the Anonymous Foundation, quintupled the amount of money being put into family planning. And what they've done is they've gone to governments and said, here's a way to do family planning, a particular way to think about contraception. We're going to do it in 69 countries. We want you countries to match us. And I said to the Gates person I was talking to, I said, I don't understand, are you saying this is like one-size-fits-all model? And the answer was yes. And I said, and the governments are supposed to match you, and where's that money coming from? I mean, you can do what you want with your money, but where's their matching funds coming from? Are they taking it out of other forms of family planning? Are they that is troublesome, right? And yes, we do that as well. All the large foundations that seek to leverage their assets into public policy do so. Now, that leads to what I think is my last point, which is I'm not troubled by that if, while our aspiration is to see public policy change, our means are simply to develop evidence, develop best models, to do demonstration projects and so on, and then put it out there and let the democratic process work it out, which is, to a large extent, the way foundations traditionally worked. It becomes problematic when what you do goes well beyond that, and when it comes to climate change, we will both come up with, but we're going to try and do what we can to pressure government. We, of course, don't violate the law. We don't lobby directly for legislation, but we do advocacy campaigns that are beyond just putting this out there. We are going to do what we can to influence the government to cut down on the use of coal, to cut down on the use of oil, to do something to better regulate the fracking industry, and so on, right? Now, that is problematic. It is. I'm troubled by it. At the moment, though, of course, we have a bigger problem, which is if we don't do that, since the democratic process has degraded to the point where evidence doesn't matter and best models don't matter and demonstrations don't matter because the government is so screwed up in terms of the way the process is working and the political polarization that it's produced, we're wasting our funding and we're not able to serve that role. So for the moment, we are in a Hobson's choice. We either do a kind of advocacy we're uncomfortable with, or we sacrifice the ability to do the things that we can do well. Our short-term solution is, as is for most foundations, to do the advocacy. Yeah. But the long-term solution has to be for foundations as well as the rest of us to fix that process, right? To get back to the point where the polarization is not so extreme. So, think of climate as the example. There is tons for conservatives and liberals to disagree about what to do about the problem of climate change. It is preposterous that we are having an argument about whether it is happening. And the reason we're having that argument is because the factual issues themselves have gotten mapped onto the political and culture wars so that ideology is driving the interpretation of facts rather than the reverse. And that problem needs to be solved. And we have to play a role in doing that so that, in fact, we can go back to the world that Rob talks about and that I think we're all pretty comfortable with.
Yeah, as Larry knows, the description, I think, meant to be a provocation, but is not entirely unfair, is that plutocracy rides into the rescue of democracy. If we see this massive democratic dysfunction, we think that the wisdom that can reside within foundations can begin to do some repair.
Future James Madison.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Madison.
Right. Okay, well, let's open it up for a broader conversation. I guess there are a couple things I want to pull out of the really useful comments. One was to just notice again Chiara's observation that, well, foundations aren't, strictly speaking, necessary. Look at Ireland, look at France. Does democracy need a foundation? So I'm curious, especially Larry, would you just resist that as with me, a first principles, let's design democratic society, bad way to frame the question, let's not ask about necessary or not, let's just see what's in front of us and go from there. I would agree that foundations aren't necessary. What is necessary is that a democratic society should find a way to design institutions of some kind or another for long-time horizon experimentation and thinking. Federalism is one such design principle. Foundations seem to be another one, and we can then look at the merits of this.
Actually, publicly supported universities are another one.
That's right, that would be another one as well. Universities are essentially like large foundations in that there's a big endowment, operates the same way, the same legal structure as a foundation, devoted just to the internal purpose of what the university does. Anyway, so the conversation about the necessary condition. And then Susan, your conversation, and that bled into some of the things you said, Larry, about accountability structures. So Susan, you gave this really sort of powerful explanation about how you think foundations are obligated to be accountable. Maybe not legally imposed accountability, but they should be accountable to their grantees. They should be accountable for performance measurements, this kind of thing. So I wonder whether or not you would support in that spirit the idea that, well, in order to create a welcome mechanism for that type of accountability, all foundations should put at least 1 or 2 representatives on their governing board from their grantees. That would create an incentive structure within the foundation to be quite accountable to their grantees. That currently, of course, is not a requirement.
Right. I mean, I noticed, I agreed immediately when I read the first page of the article that there's a governance issue, that these are very closed governance structures and board composition is very closed. I think on the one hand, that's part of the problem, but I'm not sure it's the solution. I've seen a lot of very bad governance and very bad accountability from boards that have independent representation. So I'm not sure externally imposed requirements are really the answer. But I'm not sure I have a specific answer other than that I think it does need to be this proactive sort of hopefully systemic looking at what best practices, standards, in a way a little bit what independent sector has done for the nonprofit sector more broadly. There's a checklist on accountability. What do we all think are good standards of accountability? And in a way, many people engage in them voluntarily in order to fend off excessive requirements. But I do think part of that, just if I can just take this opportunity to answer your comment earlier, the Peter Thiel comment. I think part of this accountability that my sense, and I don't have any empirical basis for this, but my sense is that foundations don't do quite as well as the nonprofit sector generally in asking the question, are we doing harm? And that's, I mean, to your point of, well, I have a lot of money and I have this particular interest and, I'd like to give 97 giraffes to the San Francisco Zoo, and is that a good thing for anybody? I think that's part of a voluntary accountability. And
Go ahead.
Well, the goals that you mentioned seem like quite desirable to me, the ones like diversity of opinion outside of the government, money to be spent by minority groups of whatever kind that don't need 51% of the vote to get done. And the objections seem fine, like why should, I don't have a problem with rich people. There is a problem with rich people controlling things. And so how do we have another solution to funding diverse sources of power, of money being spent on experimentation, on long-range projects, which don't involve having rich people being in control of that experiment, those things? And the answer is yes, we do. There are easy ways to do that. Well, not easy, nothing is easy, but within our existing system, without rewriting the whole Constitution and government, you give people the money to spend as they wish on experiments or on things that foundations might do. Give each individual $100 from the federal treasury. Everyone gets the same amount.
Right.
They can donate it to all these different causes for doing these things, for experiment, all those good goals you have. It's not controlled by the rich. It can be organized with this crowdsourcing software, and then you have the advantages without all these disadvantages.
Yeah, so to amplify that a bit, the idea would be something like, let's get rid of the deduction as the incentive structure or mechanism we use, and let's change it to an identical tax credit for every single individual. Bill Gates gets $1,000, I get $1,000, and you get $1,000 in terms of public subsidy for our own civil society, experimentation, innovation, diversity, pluralism preferences. That's possible, certainly to do, and then we have a bunch of questions about whether or not it's really possible with that small amount of money to carry out the kind of social policy, innovation, and experimentation and subject it to social science evidence. Doesn't that require a much greater, a much larger asset base to do that? In the article, I propose, rather than a ceiling on foundation size, a floor on foundation size. You don't get to create a foundation until you have, call it, $10 million or $20 million. If you have less than that and you want to do a foundation, just write checks from your checkbook pocket and don't take advantage of the foundation form because it's not big enough actually to meet the demand of discovery. So that's where I would resist the view that it's $1,000 or whatever number is going to be enough to get the kind of social policy experimentation.
That's where crowdsourcing comes in. The Foundation A says, "Give me your $1,000."
Right.
And if you get a total of $10 million, then you
And then we get the majority bias back in play, because as the crowdsourcing mechanism works, what you're looking for is more and more people weighing in. I'm not against the crowdsourcing experiment. I hope that there's all kinds of innovation in crowdsourcing platforms to try to get new experiments up and running. The more and more a crowdsourcing experiment depends upon many, many people weighing in and contributing, the more it looks like it has the kind of worries about majority preferences being inscribed or installed rather than minority preferences. Let's get a couple more questions in. There's someone right in the back, and then we'll come right around.
I did fundraising for a local nonprofit for several years, and I found that oftentimes the foundations that were the least transparent always, not always, but most often expected the most out of fundraisers. You know, their guidelines for the grant applications were very intensive, and they often wanted us to change our program to fit their guidelines rather than just trusting us as a proven program. And do you have any thoughts on that? That was just sort of my experience for the several years that I did fundraising, is this disconnect between the trust for foundations into the nonprofit organizations and the expectation of us to sort of tailor ourselves to them rather than them letting us do what we are.
Yeah, well, I'll offer one quick observation, and maybe Larry wants to say something about this. I mean, so one thing I've heard quite frequently as I give talks about foundations and nonprofits, and I have to say, since I don't work at a foundation, I don't really know this from the inside, but a kind of old-style philanthropy is find really good people or really good organizations and give them money just to enhance their capacity to do more of the good stuff that they're already doing. We trust you that you're doing good stuff. Here's a bunch of more money to do more of it. A new style philanthropy views every particular grantee as a kind of subcontractor for the foundation strategy that is implemented through the collected works of the grantees. And so they don't just give you money to carry out what you're already doing, they give you money to carry out one piece of the foundation's own theory of change, and you're just the subcontractor for that particular piece of work, which is to say, in your words, they don't trust you as much to just do what you're doing. They're trusting you or paying you to do, giving you money to do, the thing that they had set out from before to want you to do. Whether or not that actually describes a new form of philanthropy, I can't say, but I've heard this before from people. Is this?
Yeah, no, I think, so first, I don't think there's a connection between transparency and the onerousness with which they do due diligence, or yet a third thing, you know, the extent to which they want to fund you to do what you do and they want to fund you to do what they want you to do. I think those are all different in different foundations, you know, so, but the latter two are definitely issues. Rob has put his finger on the main source, which is the development of outcome-focused strategic philanthropy has increasingly led to, you know, we're not funding organizations to do what they do. We have a particular end and we're driving toward it, and if you're interested in helping us with it, we think you're good enough to do it. Sometimes that drives towards lots of due diligence on our part. We want to make sure that you're going to do what we want you to do. Sometimes it doesn't, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Joni, where are you? Why don't we go right there? Yeah.
In terms of accountability, if the foundations were simply required to very slowly deplete their funding compared to what they're getting, say, on interest, and require that for them to stay around, they have to raise. I don't know what the rules are about this.
There's a 5% payout rule for United States foundations. You have to pay out every year 5% of your assets, and that includes administrative costs.
But 5% is irrelevant if you're making 7%.
Right, 5% was a number targeted as making endowments possible, long-term and perpetual.
Right, so my point is that you end up accountable when you're forced to, over time, still raise some amount of money, and otherwise you just fizzle and die. So I'm just...
Yeah, there are some debates that would want to increase the payout requirement so that either you have to hope you really get great returns in the investment of your assets in the marketplace, or you end up spending down and going out of existence. And I think the impetus behind these is less to make foundations still scan around the horizon to raise additional funds over the course of time, than that it would be a good thing for foundations to die out after an X number of years, and assuming that there will be new forms of wealth created in succeeding generations, a set of new foundations come into existence which themselves die out. And rather than having perpetuity as the expectation, have a time delimited existence.
I
Also,
wasn't
Ron,
making-
the question you want to ask, though, is even assuming you're right and that created a kind of accountability, whether it's a good one, because you're creating accountability now to the people you have to fundraise from. So one of the complaints we often get at the university is we're accountable to our big donors, and they're shaping what we do much more than they should. There's no such thing as independence, really. There's always accountability. It's all just a question of who you want to be accountable to.
Thank you. I wanted to just try to bring up the point about, it seems to me that a core aspect of a functioning democracy is, in fact, its ability to take diverse interests and try to at least come up with some workable definition of a common good or democratically, or arrive at aims, common aims. And I'm going to cite, I don't think he's here, one of your colleagues, Bruce Sievers, who's made this point in the past about the notion that foundations don't seem that interested in investing in civil society, and in particular, the ability for our society to arrive at common aims. And in fact, because of value pluralism, they actually, in some ways, they sort of reinforce kind of the polarization in a way in our process. Any thoughts?
So the reference was to Bruce Sievers, who's also a visiting scholar at the PAC Center. I won't try to rehearse his views, but they have something to do with the idea that part of the function of civil society is to allow succeeding generations over time to try to identify what the common good is. I guess I wouldn't resist the language of common good, but I would make it not in tension with pluralism, but in relation to it. So the idea is that it's a common good for all of us as citizens to have certain institutions in society designed to operate for experimentation and discovery over a long time horizon. The benefits of that aggregation of individual efforts for our common good are considerable. So the pluralism itself, over a long time horizon and aggregated, not any particular individual innovation or experiment, is itself of common benefit.
I guess that I'm just wondering if there's a distinction between, because I see that in terms of pluralism in the different ways to attack a problem and solve but I'm wondering if that's distinct from pluralism in terms of what the end goal is, and when you have people that have vastly different views on how society, what its value should be, and that seems to me different. And if you can't get people to come at least closer to a common idea of what the end goal is, how do you encourage innovation toward very disparate ends?
Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah.
Please.
I mean, in response to that, I would just say that it's the fact that foundation might have a different role doesn't imply that philanthropy, more traditional form of philanthropy, might still have the role of funding association for the purpose of fostering social capital in a society, and associations that can produce that kind of deliberative environment that I think you are referring to. So perhaps foundations are not the most appropriate philanthropic institution for that kind of purpose, but I think that we can still support a system of individual philanthropy that would perform that role.
Right.
Hi. So I'm very interested in the claim or argument that philanthropic foundations can experiment or discover new forms of beneficent activities that governments cannot do because of short-sighted politicians, or the government policy should be supported by the majority. It all sounds good in words, but my first question is whether foundations in the real world are playing those roles.
Yeah.
And the failure in serving those values, or the possibility of the failure, leads me to the second question. So I like your conclusion that foundations deserve their institutional protection, like tax status, only when they serve these functions.
Right.
But I take your conclusion not to be just a wish. It's just nice that they serve those functions. I think there should be some institutional measures to make it the case that they play those roles. But the thing is, the punchline. So the institutional measures seems to be in conflict with the non-accountability, which in your view enables those institutions to take the longer-term perspective and to try non-popular things. So I'm just wondering what might cope with this kind of dilemma situation.
Right, good. I do think it's appropriate to hold, this was the point of the article of my argument, to hold philanthropic foundations to the standard of discovery, or less so pluralism, but just fix on discovery or experimentation for a moment. And that if it turns out, just as you said, that foundations don't do the things that they're distinctively made able to do by the institutional protection of the legal form of the foundation, then they haven't justified these privileges of the institutional form. Similarly, if scholars, as I said before, don't take long time horizon, scholarly, risky investments of their own talent and just do small ball, relatively incremental, conservative research, then we don't deserve the protection of tenure. How will we decide this? What will be the institutional metric to figure out whether or not foundations have performed their distinctive role or scholars have performed their distinctive role? I wish I had a candidate answer for you right now. I have some ideas, but I have to say, I mean, I'd be interested whether Larry or Susan or Chiara think differently. Partly because of the lack of transparency of foundations. Foundations are just massively understudied, under-examined. They're seen as the free expression of people with money doing good things for which we ought to be grateful, end of story. And we don't bother to inquire very much into whether their activities are even transparent, much less then begin to measure them. And maybe there are some beginning efforts afoot to try to push in that direction. I am partial probably to a bunch of formal incentive mechanisms without diminishing the permissibility for long time horizon that would give people who exist in a foundation reason to act more in this manner than not, rather than, as I take Susan to be saying, a bunch of exhortation. You ought to be doing this because you're accountable, but all the accountability is meant to be internalized by you, not to be imposed from the outside. I don't have a policy prescription to offer you, unfortunately. I don't even know if I should say I'm working on that. I think that's a question really worth asking, and let me see if anyone has anything to add on that.
I have a lot, but I'll defer to you guys if you want to.
Go ahead.
So, okay, so I want to come back to the democracy point and tie it together. So the purpose of democracy would not be to find a common good. That's way too thin a theory. I mean, I think the easiest way or the best way to think about it, if you have to do this quickly, is we have a problem of governance in a complex society, put aside what the form is, right? Which is we need to find a workable set of solutions so we can live together, hopefully advance our interests as a collective, but also leave room for individuals and accommodate all the huge differences. Right, so democracy is a means of doing that, and we create a pretty complex system because we're always balancing. There's not always a common good, and so we're just trying to figure it out as we go along. The result is we don't actually hold it to any sort of rigid standards. So take the question you asked and put it on almost any institution in society, and we're not going to know, and we couldn't probably know, and if we tried to force it into some sort of scientific specificity, we would probably ruin the institution, right? Does the legislature actually represent the people? I mean, there's a huge literature on all the ways in which it's false, but what we go by is ultimately a kind of seat-of-the-pants judgment that, on balance, this seems to us better than the alternatives, and the risks that are entailed by either trying to quantify, specify, or impose rigid rules are going to be more costly than not. It's a kind of standard legal problem where we go with standards over rules because the costs of rules are worse. Same thing with tenure, and same thing with foundations as far as I'm concerned, which is I think I'm comfortable myself with the amount of anecdotal evidence that I see in just looking around that foundations contribute a lot of good. To be comfortable to think that it would be a huge mistake to try and do it foundation by foundation, that the incentive structure that would create would be disastrous, and that once you get into sort of saying, well, let's measure on a whole, you're going to be lying to yourself about what you're actually measuring. So we're stuck with a kind of seat-of-the-pants judgment. The weirdest thing about this is if I look around the society today and I say, what are the institutions that we ought to be worried about in our democratic society? With all the problems that there might be with foundations, I don't think we make the top 50, right? I mean, there are institutions that require a looking at and a fixing, that are much, much more profoundly problematic for the society today than foundations are.
All right, one more question. Go ahead right here.
Hi. So, I mean, I think the existence of a university like Stanford and Harvard are testament to the deep-seated antecedents that we have for private philanthropy in this country. And I think it's a good thing, you know, because as governments rise and fall, as budgets rise and fall, the, you know, these institutions, like Harvard was established for religious freedom, Stanford was, you know, established for other reasons. You know, they provide an independent source for things that the government doesn't provide.
Agreed, and that's partly why in a democratic society, I think a foundation, because of the longer time horizon it has and the institutional permissions that enable it to have that longer time horizon, make it on balance a good thing for democratic society when it carries out the distinctive function I attributed to it. And as I said before, not at all disagreeing with the point you make, universities are identically, legally speaking, to foundations in that there's an endowment, private universities are. There's an endowment protected under the law, invested in the marketplace with a 5% payout. And the 5% payout goes to not grant making, but to the internal function of the university, which gives it a certain independence from the political winds that exist in democratic society and in the marketplace. And when it turns out to be the case that the norms of democratic accountability infect and invade the university, or the norms of marketplace accountability infect or invade the university, you begin to sacrifice the distinctive independence that's made possible by the legal form that is the university endowment itself.
Okay, well, on that note, I hope you'll come back next year to find out about the other 49 institutions in society that raise questions of ethics and wealth.
Yeah.
And please join me in thanking Rob and the panel for a wonderful discussion.
Thanks.